Tombstones. Slade was the surname of the local undertaker and village drunk, who had a tendency to wander off when he was on a bender, and who ironically killed himself by drowning in 6 inches of water in the creek. When I first brought Braden to meet my parents, I told him that story. He had been driving at the time. His grin flashed like lightning. "But who," he asked, "buried the undertaker?" Back then, we had been living outside of D.C., where Braden was a resident in cardiac surgery at Johns Hopkins, and I worked at the National Zoo, trying to cobble together enough money for a graduate program in zoology. We'd only been together 3 months, but I had already moved in with him. We were visiting my parents that weekend because I knew, viscerally, that Braden Fields was the one. On that first trip back home, I had been so sure of what my future would hold. I was wrong on all counts. I never expected to be an apiarist like my father. I never thought I'd wind up sleeping in my childhood bedroom once again as an adult. I never imagined I'd settle down on a farm my older brother Jordan and I once could not wait to leave. I married Braden. He got a fellowship at Mass General. We moved to Boston. I was a doctor's wife. Then, almost a year to the day of my wedding anniversary, my father didn't come home one evening after checking his hives. My mother found him dead of a heart attack in the tall grass, bees haloing his head. My mother sold the piece of land that held our apple orchard to a couple from Brooklyn. She kept the strawberry fields, but was thoroughly at a loss when it came to my father's hives. Since my brother was busy with a high-powered legal career and my mother was allergic to bees, the apiary fell to me. For 5 years, I drove from Boston to Adams every week to take care of the colonies. After Asher was born, I'd bring him with me, leaving him in the company of my mother while I checked the hives. I fell in love with beekeeping, the slow-motion flow of pulling a frame out of a hive, the Where's Waldo search for the queen. I expanded from 5 colonies to 15. I experimented with bee genetics with colonies from Russia, from Slovenia, from Italy. I signed pollination contracts with the Brooklynites and 3 other local fruit orchards, setting up new hives on their premises. I harvested, processed, and sold honey and beeswax products at farmers' markets from the Canadian border to the suburbs of Massachusetts. I became, almost by accident, the first commercially successful beekeeper in the history of apiarist McAfee's. By the time Asher and I moved permanently to Adams, I knew I might never get rich doing this, but I could make a living. My father taught me that beekeeping is both a burden and a privilege. You don't bother the bees unless they need your help, and you help them when they need it. It's a feudal relationship, protection in return for a percentage of the fruits of their labors. He taught me that if a body is easily crushed, it develops a weapon to prevent that from happening. He taught me that sudden movements get you stung. I took these lessons a bit too much to heart. On the day of my father's funeral, and years later on the day of my mother's, I told the bees. It's an old tradition to inform them of a death in the family. If a beekeeper dies and the bees aren't asked to stay on with their new master, they'll leave. In New Hampshire, the custom is to sing, and the news has to rhyme. So I draped each colony with black crepe, knocked softly, crooned the truth. My beekeeping net became a funeral veil. The hive might well have been a coffin. By the time I come downstairs that morning, Asher's in the kitchen. We have a deal. Whoever gets up first makes the coffee. My mug still has a wisp of steam rising. He is shoveling cereal into his mouth, absorbed in his phone. "Morning," I say, and he grunts in response. For a moment, I let myself stare at him. It's hard to believe that soft-centered little boy who would cry when his hands got sticky with propolis from the hives can now lift a super full of 40 pounds of honey as if it weighs no more than his hockey stick. Asher is over 6 feet tall, but even as he was growing, he was never ungainly. He moves with a kind of grace you find in wildcats, the ones that can steal away a kitten or a chick before you even realize they've gone. Asher has my blonde hair and the same ghost green eyes, for which I've always been grateful. He carries his father's last name, but if I also had to see Braden every time I looked at my son, it would be that much harder. I catalog the breadth of his shoulders, the damp curls at the nape of his neck, the way the tendons in his forearms shift and play as he scrolls through his texts. It's shocking sometimes to be confronted with this, when a second ago he sat on my shoulders, trying to pull down